A lot of talk around here about the Iran deal. It's over. We made our best effort. We fully exposed exactly what is in this agreement. We had hours and hours and days, weeks and weeks of debate over this. It's been on our plate here for now, ever since the beginning of the negotiations. Some of us started to express alarm and concerns about the direction of those negotiations and what was potentially being given away, but we really weren't sure exactly until, fortunately, thanks to the Corker Amendment, the Congress had to weigh in and was required for the administration to give us the ability to look at every word of this agreement, the annexes and everything attached to it. It's only later on we found out there were 2 secret side agreements which we weren't able to see. And that alone, in my opinion, should have been enough to vote against this amendment. How can you enter into any kind of contractual relationship with a nation or with a car dealer if that person you're negotiating with says, well, you know, there's a couple of secret things over here that you can't have access to, but don't worry, it really won't mess things up. No one's going to sign an agreement like that except the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, apparently. So we've made a valiant effort here to defeat this. Many of us have poured our heart and soul into this, not just for days, not just for weeks, not just for months, but for years. Yes, the American people have learned a lot more about this, a lot more than what has been whitewashed out of the White House or marketed out of the White House in terms of how good this is for the future of America and for our national security and for the future of the world. And I think we've exposed in many, many ways. I've listed at least 10 major issues that we conceded, that were goals that we wanted to achieve going into the negotiations, and we conceded on every single point. And I'm not going to go back over that in the interest of time here. All I'm here to do is say, I guess I'm not ready to give up. I said earlier on the floor, quoted Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. Everybody said it's over. But the consequences of this are not over. The results of this are not over. We will be living this out for the duration of this agreement. And at the end of this agreement, Iran will have completed exactly the goal that it's trying to reach. In fact, they may complete it much earlier than that. And that is the legitimization of their possession of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon capability. This is a country that says we only need to develop this for medical isotopes, to fuel a reactor that's going to produce electricity for our people, despite all the sun, the wind, and the unlimited amount of oil and gas underneath their soil. That can provide that much cheaper than any other form. So there's no justification for their going forward except for achieving that one goal that we know they have worked for years. We know that they have lied about in terms of to organizations that we know that have been sanctioning this. And we've simply now given them a pathway to achieve this and a legitimization of their achievement of this. So to say that all the consequences will be good because Iran will abide by every part of this agreement, and you know, throughout this process, there's going to be a major change in Iran. The theocracy will be overthrown. They'll become a responsible neighbor and nation. And this is the pathway to achieving that. That's the vision of the president. That's the dream. And frankly, Mr. President, I hope that my assessment of this is wrong. For the sake of the future of the United States and the sake of the future of Israel and the sake of the future of the world, I hope I am wrong. But there's nothing in this agreement, and there is nothing that has been said or done by the Iranian regime that would give us any indication, any hint at all to any kind of change in their behavior. In fact, as they deride our agreement, our negotiators, and embarrass our president day after day after day with death to America and extinction of Israel, we ought to be all the more concerned that something like that the administration has wished for and hoped for by extending the hand of friendliness that would happen. I simply don't think it will. And so what will be the consequences? As I said, I've discussed at length what I think is wrong with this bill. I won't go over that again today. It's of the record. But there will be consequences that I don't think we have fully discussed, and I want to lay out some of those. For Iran, liberation. Liberation from all sanctions. Back in business. And they will become rich. They will become rich with the release of hundreds of billions of dollars that are now sanctioned and will be released. And they will be using that for any number of purposes. Their oil industry, dominated by the Republican Guards. This is not Exxon. This is not Mobil. This is not Occidental Petroleum. This is not any of our international oil companies. This is the Republican Guard, a military organization, dominates that oil industry. They will be free to exploit one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Their national income will spike, state coffers will fill, and Iran's terrorist adventures and proxy wars will be well funded. We all know that Iran's ambitions for dominance throughout the Middle East and to be recognized as a world nuclear power, they'll have all the more money now to be able to feed their proxies, fighting for them in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in a number of places throughout the Middle East. And their terrorist threats resonate across the globe. After nearly a decade of international efforts to force Iran to give up on this dangerous and illegal nuclear activity, Iran now has a green light, a pathway built for them by U.S. concessions in this agreement to reach nuclear weapons capability. We have entirely conceded to Iran the right to create fissile material that can have only one use: nuclear weapons. Now let's look at the larger question, the region, and the strategic impact of this on the region. We haven't really had a great deal of discussion on this, the strategic consequences. I discussed it briefly during some of my time earlier in this week and last week. But the Iranian continuing revolution and regional misbehavior all affect the Middle East and all affect the world. And it's dangerous and it's irresponsible. Former Secretaries of State Kissinger and Shultz, well regarded for their experience and well recognized as global experts and international experts, they discussed this broader strategic point in an important joint article that was released last April. Former Secretaries Kissinger and Shultz explained that the then outlined deal was so weak that Iran will inevitably expand its power and Sunni states will inevitably proliferate in its response, in their response. And the United States will get dragged in to Middle East wars, except this time the wars may be nuclear. Let me quote from their statement. Previous thinking on nuclear strategy, the secretaries explained, assumed the existence of stable state actors. Iran is anything but stable. How will these doctrines translate into a region where sponsorship of non-state proxies is common, the state structure is under assault, and death on behalf of jihad is a kind of fulfillment? Wise words from wise people who've had a lifetime of experience. Unfortunately, these views seem to have been largely ignored, if not completely ignored, by this administration because it didn't fit the purpose, their purpose to complete a deal no matter what. No matter what we had to give up, they wanted to complete this deal. In fact, a State Department spokesman was quoted as disparaging the two statesmen, Kissinger and Shultz, saying that their opinion was just, and I quote, big words and big thoughts, and that the two were, quote, not living in the real world. not living in the real world. I think that application applies much more to the President and his Secretary of State than it does to former Secretaries of State Kissinger and Shultz. Let's look at proliferation. Some of us have discussed the obvious proliferation dangers flowing from an agreement that puts Iran on the path to nuclear weapons. But despite the reluctant words of acquiescence that has been wrung out of others in the region, who can possibly argue that Iran now will never be permitted to develop these nuclear weapons technologies without a response from others? If I were the king of Saudi Arabia, if I were the prime minister or president of any major country in the Middle East, I'm not going to stand by and watch Iran achieve nuclear dominance. They're going to take their own action. And we have now basically shredded the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. This is a mortal blow to that treaty that we have worked for nearly half a century to defend. It's gone. Let's look at Syria, the impact on Syria. America's appalling lack of effective response to the open wound that is Syria is one example of the paralysis born out of that obsession. The single-minded obsession with finding accommodation to the Iranian regime. Iran is the principal prop for the brutal Syrian regime. Assad could not have remained in power these past 4 years of catastrophic disintegration of his country without Iranian support. And I fear that our negotiations with Iran had taken on such an overwhelming priority with an administration obsessed with legacy that it helped freeze us into inaction on Syria. The administration claims that the nuclear negotiations were about Iran's nuclear misbehavior only and were never intended to address the rest of region brutality. That's true in some cases, but carefully reading of the annexes and carefully reading of the agreement, by doing so, we now know that the administration went well beyond just discussing this nuclear capability issue. It did not address the hostages that were being held by the Iranian regime, the Americans. It did not address the ballistic missile development and proliferation. Those are two issues that had nothing to do with the agreement itself, according to the administration proposal and statement that we wouldn't go outside of that particular issue. So they did go outside of that issue. Negotiations between the Ayatollahs and the Great Satan, that's us, according to the Ayatollah, could not happen in a vacuum. Subjects not addressed by the negotiators nevertheless are affected by them, and our stupefying passivity on Syria proves the case. Let's look at Russia. Our problems with Russia have only grown and multiplied as we tried to ignore Russian misbehavior during our joint negotiations with Iran. But worse, our obsession with getting a deal has unleashed a Russian-Iran axis. Their new cooperation creates yet another threat to American interests. Just days after concluding this deal, the commander of Iran's elite Quds force, General Soleimani, flew to Moscow, which he was sanctioned not to be able to do, but he did anyway, by the UN, reportedly to convince the Russians to step in and help shore up the crumbling Assad regime in Syria. It worked. The Russians are now in Syria in force, building barracks and bringing in trainers, tanks, and other heavy weapons. Iran and Russia together are Assad's best friends, maybe his savior. And by ignoring Syria, by empowering and enriching Iran and making Putin's Russia an actual negotiating partner, we've created the perfect storm. This is the price of dealing with the devil. Lastly, let me talk about Israel, because any discussion of consequences must return to what should be a core issue, the core issue, the consequences for our only and best friend in the Middle East, Israel, the only democratic ally in the region. We cannot ignore the major risk that will follow through with their often repeated threats of obliterating the state of Israel, a threat repeated by the supreme leader in no uncertain terms just this week. Is this hyperbole or posturing, as the administration claims? The Israelis don't think so, and I don't think so. We have to assume that an extremist, violent state like Iran, after decades of creating, arming, and guiding terrorist organizations devoted to Israel's destruction, will continue their assault one day, now, we know, with nuclear weapons. One day, others may look back through the smoke and ashes created by this Iran deal and wonder, how could we ever been so blind? How could we ever have conceded to an agreement that violated every goal that the previous previous three presidents and current president said we must not concede on? And that is, it is totally unacceptable for Iran to have possession of nuclear weapon capability. 2 Democrat presidents, 2 Republican presidents, over 2 decades, 3 decades of time, have made that statement. It was the goal of the United States to do everything in its capability to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, and we just signed an agreement that gave them the pathway to that nuclear weapon. Does it possibly delay their achievement of that? Yes. But does it reach the goal of preventing them from having it? No. And so after all the shouting and all the effort and all the debate and all the examination of the agreements, we stand here and are told to give up. It's done deal. The President used his, quote, executive authority to deem this an agreement and not a treaty, which is a farce in and of itself. But we're now told, give it up, we've got to move on, other things to do, you made your best effort, we won, you lost. No, America lost. America lost, and we will be paying a price year after year after year as we watch the flow of money into Iran, the flow of oil out of Iran with money in return, supporting proxy wars throughout the Middle East, igniting a nuclear arms race in that tinderbox of the world. And we will regret the day, that the announcement was made that we have signed a deal with Iran. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.